Hi everybody, it's Sunday, and so I'm here to talk a little bit about your responses to last week's reading and to say a little bit about the work that we're beginning now. So first of all, thank you for getting through both Poe. Some of you read both Poe and Melville stories. There was an interesting kind of divide. Most of you wrote about Poe, but a few of you also were brave enough to write about Benito Cereno. I think if you actually read both stories together, as I know a few of you did, you can see interesting resonances happening between the two. And of course, the most resonant scene might be the shaving scene in Murders in the Rue Morgue and the shaving scene in Benito Cereno. But certainly, right, both of these texts, Melville's more obviously, Poe's more secretly, right, are about race, right, and they are about racial divisions, racism, and racial fears in the or the antebellum United States. So, and of course, we begin this unit, right, on thinking about these tensions, these various tensions in the U.S. at that time. The next work that we're going to look at addresses those tensions very, very directly. Right? And this is, of course, Frederick Douglass's, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. And I say the full title there because the title is so very important, right? And really unpacking the three parts of that title will be important to an understanding of Douglass. Douglass was an extraordinary man, right? Absolutely extraordinary. He was born into slavery as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey in Talbot County, Maryland. And he was given his name, at least in part, by his mother, Harriet Bailey. And then years later, after he escaped to the north, he took on the surname Douglass. He'd already dropped the use of his middle names at that point, but he renamed himself Douglass. And that renaming is going to be significant, right? It has, whenever one renames oneself, one is saying something about the nature of identity. It's also important to think about that last name Bailey and why he might have wanted to be rid of it. Oftentimes, right, most often, slaves had the names of the last names, surnames of their masters. And so certainly, right, one of the ways in which Douglass declares his freedom is by changing his name and getting rid of the name of his master. His mother, right, gives him his first name, Frederick, and he always remains Frederick, right, although his last name changes. It was briefly Johnson at one point when he got married, and then later on it was Douglass, and stayed that way. The exact date, though, of Douglass's birth is unknown. He chose to celebrate his birth date on February 14th. But there's absolutely no way that he could know when it was, and that was, of course, because slaves were not considered human beings, right, and they were not considered worthy of birthdays. There's some complicated reasons for this, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's important, right? Frederick Douglass literally does not know the day on which he is born. And in fact, he doesn't really know the year in which he's born either. He makes a guess at that, but again, he cannot tell us. Right on that first page of Frederick Douglass's narrative, right, he tells us, "I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it." Fascinating. If you don't know your birthday, if you don't know the year in which you were born, you've already been alienated to a certain degree from history. And that alienation from history, that inability to act within history, is something that all slaves had in common, and it was something that Douglass wanted to reverse. Right? He wanted people, slaves, to become agents in history. And to be an agent in history, you have to have one. Right? You have to have even your own history. The other interesting, or one other interesting thing about Douglass is that he is of mixed race. He was certainly part African on his mother's side, but also probably part Native American. Douglass's mother was not brought herself from Africa, right? She is already here, and there's some sense that her own bloodlines are mixed between African and also Native American. And then on his father's side, European and American. And this is because it is highly likely that Douglass's father was also his master. And that situation, which was not unusual for slaves, as we know, many slave masters raped slave women who then had their children. And of course, but that duality of race is problematic for Douglass. Right? What is it like to be a slave, right? A black slave, but also to have a white father? It's a very strange position psychologically. Now, after his escape from slavery, about which you're going to be reading this week if you haven't read it before, Douglass had a very long and varied career, and certainly a distinguished one. He was an abolitionist, right, incredibly important to the abolitionist movement. He was also a preacher, and you might find this interesting because Douglass is very angry about the way Southern slave owners used Christianity, used the Bible to justify slavery. He is himself a religious man, but he's also very angry about literal readings of the Bible that justify slavery. He was also a huge supporter of women's suffrage in its early days. Very important for him. He was at Seneca Falls, and in fact, he will be at Seneca Falls immediately before his death at another time. He went abroad, right? He traveled a lot, and he traveled to Europe where he lectured on his experience of slavery and also on the kinds of social changes that he saw necessary in America. And of course, he was a writer of great distinction. I've set aside a little more time to talk about Douglass than I have for many of the other works. And in some ways this is unfair, but in some ways I think it's quite fair. Douglass is the only African American we're reading for this course on early American literature, but he is not the only African American writer of this time period. And so while I'm hoping actually that you might use this extra time to look into the history of African American literature a little more fully, and to research some other writers who are important in this moment. There are a lot of them. Harriet Jacobs would be a natural person to look at next to Douglass. And a very interesting way of looking at Douglass is to read Douglass and Jacobs together, because slavery was also a gendered experience. And Jacobs tells us things about her experience of slavery that are particular to her, but also particular to women slaves, whereas Douglass is able to give us more of a portrait of what happens to male slaves. I've also put in a few extra links in this section, not for this week, but for next week, although you should feel free, obviously, to range around on the site in both of those weeks to look at these links. Some of them have to do with the Southern antebellum pro-slavery literature, which really rose up in response to the slave narratives that Douglass and many of his contemporaries wrote. It's a horrifying body of literature, but also an interesting one and an important one to be aware of. And I've also, I think, put in a couple of links to Douglass's other autobiographies, because while we're reading the first autobiography, Douglass actually wrote 3 autobiographies. It was an important form for him. So the first autobiography that Frederick Douglass writes, he writes in 1845. And the dates here are important because it's important to see how far before, right, the Civil War and before the Emancipation Proclamation and before the end of the Civil War, Douglass is writing this narrative. Right, we are a full 20 years before the end of the Civil War. And this work is, of course, it's a memoir in many ways, and it's a treatise on abolition, and it's one of the most influential works really leading up to the Civil War. I also think that from a literary point of view, it may be Douglass's finest work. It's very short, but like Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, it has a kind of concentration, I guess I'd say, that is incredibly beautiful and incredibly compelling. Really quite an extraordinary work. It's also the prototype for the slave narratives, many slave narratives written by slaves in the antebellum South. Right? So Douglass's work is not, Douglass's first autobiography is not important just in of itself, although it is an extremely important work, but it's important because it's the beginning of a genre. Right? It really establishes what that genre will be. His next autobiography is called My Bondage and My Freedom, and it's also an autobiographical narrative, but it's published in 1855, so 10 years after his first autobiography. And it's an expansion of that autobiography, but of course it's also, as the first one was, an extremely moving meditation on the meaning of slavery and race and freedom, and on the power of literacy, of an individual, right, who escaped slavery, but for whom slavery is still in existence, right? So even though Douglass has escaped from the South in 1855, he's pretty well established in the North. Slavery exists, right? And Douglass is still very much in danger when he writes this work. And so this text, which is about him, though, is also about a nation that keeps slaves. It's a kind of portrait of America at this time, a rather damning, obviously very damning portrait. This autobiography is interesting for a number of reasons, but one thing I just point out to you in case you want to try to find it, locate it, is that in 1855, the 1855 edition has an appendix, and in that appendix, Douglass includes a letter that he wrote to his first master. It's a very interesting document, and you might decide you want to write about it or expand your post on Douglass by looking at that letter. And finally, there was a third autobiography called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, published first in 1881, and then revised and expanded a little bit, and republished in 1892. And this is his last autobiography. And this is an interesting autobiography because it's the first and the only, right, of Douglass's autobiographies that is written after the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, right, after the slaves are really freed. And so he can say a great deal more in this autobiography than he could in either of the previous autobiographies about how he managed to escape. Lots of details about slavery that he couldn't include in either of the other two works because it simply would have been too dangerous to do so. And one notable thing about this autobiography is that Douglass also talks about his meetings with Lincoln here. So fascinating. John Brown also and Lincoln, really two very interesting figures with whom Douglass was involved in very important ways. So Douglass is exceptional, but when we talk about Douglass as exceptional and extraordinary, we must also realize how deeply he would have disliked this kind of exceptionalism that we are giving to him, because he really he wasn't writing his texts simply as personal texts, and he wasn't thinking of his story or himself in the story as a kind of hero. His texts are what we call social texts, and that's something that I talk about a lot more in the lectures. But Douglas's sense of what a text is it's not something that glorifies the author. It's not about just oneself. It's about it's always something more than that. The portrait of the individual is also a portrait of a culture. And it's also a call, right? In Douglas's case, a call to those people still in the bonds of slavery to try to do what he has done. If he is simply an exceptional human being, right, it would mean that most other people are not going to be able to accomplish what he's accomplished, and he would not want us to think that at all. Now, this idea of the personal text also being a social text is absolutely everywhere encoded in Douglas's narrative. And so I think that right now what I want to do, and one of the documents that I gave you for this week's reading, was a list of conventions of the slave narrative, right? Conventions of the genre. And I want to talk about those, go over them, and say just a little bit about the really most important ones. So if you look at that document, which comes from a great book by James Olney on slave narratives, it starts out with with the very most important thing, right, or two of the most important things. Right? Most slave narratives begin with a portrait, an actual physical picture, right, maybe a photograph, right, but certainly a portrait signed by the author. And then, right, when you turn from that kind of little frontispiece of the portrait and go to the first page, you have a title page that again inscribes the claim of the writer that that he has written this or she has written this by himself or by herself. Now, it's important, right, that we look at those title pages because one of the huge things that slaves were denied was, of course, the right to literacy. Right? So many times you'll see you want to make a distinction between those slave narratives which have this claim written by himself or written by herself and those which have a rather different claim, right, written by a friend or written by so-and-so. Right? Those are very different documents. Right? Something written by oneself, you're completely in control of that material. Right? If you're speaking and somebody else is transcribing, first of all, right, that transcription, yeah, of course it's you, but it's also not you. So the more genuine narratives, right, are always going to be those ones that are written by the person in question. There's also going to be a handful, right? You're going to find many testimonials. So first we've got the portrait, right? Then we've got the title page. And then you're going to find a lot of what we call paratexts, right? Texts around the main text. Testimonials by other people about the person, right? Sometimes it'll be a white abolitionist friend of the narrator's, sometimes an editor. But you're going to find lots and lots of these texts saying something about the author of the text. And then you're going to have the actual narrative itself. And almost every single slave narrative begins with these three words: I was born. And then, right after that claim, the place where the person was born, but not a birth date. This claim, right, I was born, that may seem like a very simplistic way to start a narrative. Right? And probably if you were taking a course on autobiography and you were writing your own autobiography, you wouldn't start out by saying I was born in wherever, Port Jefferson, New York. Or if you did say that, your colleagues and your professor might say, that's a little too boring. Right? Give us something else. Find a different way of starting. But I think that we need not see this as a simplistic way of beginning a slave narrative, because what is most important to the slave is actually claiming to have an existence at all. Right? And that claim, right, that existential claim to existence, begins in those words. Right? I was born. It's simple, but it's also profound. Right? It's extremely profound. There will often be a bit of a sketchy a sketchy description of parentage, right, where lineage maybe of how the slave knows something about his or her background. There will be descriptions of cruel masters, mistresses, right, overseers. Many of the slave narratives contain, as Douglas's so famously does, right, a description of a whipping that he has witnessed. In his case, right, it's his aunt. And it's interesting too that it seems to be part of the convention, right, that many of these victims, many of these scenes of witness involved women. To think about that a little bit more, what that means. Does it simply mean that those punishments were more typically given to women, or why? What is going on there? There's usually also an account of one extremely hardworking slave who, for some reason or other, refuses to be a slave, refuses to be punished as a slave. There are lots of records of all of the barriers of to slave literacy. Right? A common theme, right, in slave narratives is just how difficult it is to get to a point where you can write a narrative, because literacy was something that was withheld. There's often a description of a so-called Christian slave owner or holder, and a condemnation of supposedly Christian slaveholders. There was a sense in the South that, and certainly Douglas had it, that slaveholders who claimed to be Christians were sometimes among the cruelest of the slaveholders, since they found a biblical justification for their oppression of a group of people. They tended to be even crueler than others. There are some accounts of the kinds of food, right, lodging, food, just supplies that slaves were given. And there's almost always an account of an auction, right? The slave auction was one of the most feared, right, one of the most dreaded scenes in a slave's life, because the slave auction almost invariably meant, right, the split up of families, the destruction of family ties. There are also descriptions of escape, right, successful attempts of escape, and sometimes of attempts at escape that were not successful at all. And almost always there is a description of the taking of a new name and a new identity. You'll also find, and this is certainly the case in Douglas, all kinds of, just as we had those sort of paratexts in the beginning with other people writing about the author, you'll also find all kinds of documentary evidence surrounding the narrative, including evidence that is horrifying, right? Bills of sale that involved the author, but also things like marriage licenses. Anything that has a legal, a kind of legal basis is extremely important to the slave and to the writer. So look for those characteristics in Douglas. It's really Douglas's narrative where we get these characteristics first, and then those characteristics disseminate into the slave narratives written by others. But think also about what they mean and why they're there. Right? Slave narratives are not a template. Right? We can talk about characteristics and features of them without saying at all that this is a kind of prescription for writing. Not at all, and certainly Douglas's was not that. It's an extraordinary piece of writing. And I would just say, I would ask you to look for one more thing, and that's the style of Douglas's writing. He writes in what we call an antithetical style, and he uses antithesis, which is he'll say one thing and then he'll say another, right, kind of countering it. all through the narrative. It's a brilliant and forceful use of style here, and certainly one of the literary reasons that we read Douglass. So, of course, we read for many reasons. Right? We read to have an understanding of language. We read to have an understanding of culture. In Douglass's case, we read for both of those reasons. It's a wonderful, fascinating, terrifying text, which still undoubtedly has relevance to us today. And I hope that you find it as moving as I do. And I look forward, not this week, we're taking a little break. You actually don't have a reading blog due this week, but next week to reading your blogs about it. All right, take care, and I'll see you next week.